Hey everybody, this is Alex, and you're listening to another episode of Thinking and Feeling Libertarian. And in this episode, what I want to do is talk about prohibition and sort of like the libertarian perspective on prohibition. And again, the aim of this podcast is never to sit there and tell you that you should think X or X is the right way to think about things. This is sort of me just giving sort of a high level from my understanding of sort of how most libertarians think. This is not about to say, hey, every libertarian thinks exactly the way I say it, nor do you have to think the way that I put it together to be a libertarian, but again, by and large. And I think one of the things that a lot of times people look at specific issues of libertarians, like they'll take a look at sort of libertarians on guns, or libertarians on abortion, or libertarians on immigration, or libertarians on drugs. And sometimes I kind of get the wrong, I think, idea of sort of how libertarians think. A lot of those particular issues all stem from the general perspective that libertarians have on prohibition. Okay, prohibition meaning basically compelling people to not purchase or engage in activity or to do literally anything. Okay, you name that, they can't do it. They can't do it generally, and libertarians care about this when it's in the realm of things where you are preventing someone from engaging in some sort of market transaction that is non-violent. So basically, you're not stealing, you are not hurting somebody else. This is just your life. And the government saying you can't do X, whether it's just because whoever's in charge has particular values that basically they want to impose on everybody else, or whether they just think that this is a better way of doing things. All probably well intended, but generally there's sort of very negative effects when you prohibit things. Also, again, you are, physically, violently intervening in people's natural activities. Okay, so to understand sort of what goes wrong when you prohibit things, and again, prohibiting things, it doesn't just mean an outright ban. So people say, hey, there's not a prohibition on X. Like, let's say there's not a prohibition on, let's say, immigration, I think, is a good example, or sometimes even you can take a look at sort of some states and sort of the way that they do sort of gun laws and whatnot. Okay, they don't necessarily outright ban things, but they make things pretty much impractical or high cost to procure. Okay, whether it's to certain services, goods, whatever. So prohibition can either be an outright ban or just be a series of policies that really raise the bar in difficulty to get something. Whether you tax something to make it really expensive, or you put a bunch of regulations, and usually in the form of sort of overabundance of inspections and paperwork that needs to be filed, that basically raises the cost to make the thing available to the point where it's not very available. Okay, so that's what prohibition is. Now, generally, when you have sort of free exchange, meaning people can just freely exchange your good or service, doesn't necessarily mean anyone can just buy anything from anyone. Okay, there are ways that a lot of these things kind of work themselves out, because again, if you sell something and it harms someone generally within the terms of, say, hey, does the person understand the risks? Is the person sort of capable to make a decision? These are things that generally get hashed out in court. But within sort of a lot of those paradigms, there's a certain amount of liability you can have selling services and goods to others. Okay, so typically to mitigate the risk of being sued, you buy insurance. Okay, and you're going to hear me tell this story a lot because it applies to a lot of other areas. So, and the insurance doesn't want to pay things out. So generally, the insurance company has a very, very clear incentive to impose rules and sort of how you do the thing they insure. So it's not that you just can do whatever you want, whenever you want, but oftentimes, when you undergo risks in a marketplace, you're going to purchase insurance, and then insurance kind of acts as this counterbalance. Basically, one, pricing the risk. So basically, hey, the more risk you're taking, the more expensive the insurance policy, discouraging you from doing more riskier things. But also, insurance policies imposing rules on their policyholders that help mitigate those risks. Okay, so oftentimes, insurance companies do act as a regulatory body because they want to be able to charge you, basically get you to pay for insurance and avoid you ever having to claim on that insurance. So they can basically, if you ever owned a house, you might see these things where insurance companies force you to basically replace your roof ever so often, whether you need it or not, or get inspections every once in a while. And these aren't legal requirements; they're requirements of a thing that you bought. Okay, so generally in a free market, again, it's not that there's no rules, but generally it's going to be sort of in this sort of balancing of risk and reward. And again, it's not just, say, risk and reward as far as how much money you make, but also in sort of the cost you have to sort of limit your liabilities. That sort of ends up regulating a lot of things. Okay, but on top of that, what happens is that when people can just buy things, like oftentimes, like for example, when it comes to like unhealthy food, people can just buy unhealthy food and they do a lot of unhealthy things, but the effects of that become really, really clear. Like you can see that there's a health issue. It's not like it's a hidden thing. Now, of course, there are issues there with transparency and information when it comes to food goods that probably could be explored in a future episode. We'll see. But in general, the idea is that when people are allowed to do things, you can see that they're doing things that aren't like great, and you can also education becomes a manner of sort of mitigating that, because you can more easily target the people who need sort of support, knowledge, whatnot. So you don't see things get as extremely bad there. You're not seeing the same kind of consequences. So typically what happens, though, when you do a prohibition, what happens is generally makes people hide their usage of things. And it doesn't mean they just suddenly say, hey, well, I guess it's illegal, can't have it. A lot of people still probably buy the good or pursue the service. Again, there will be some people who don't on the margins. Okay, and again, marginal thinking is, there's some people who, let's say that you want to do something on a scale of 1 to 10. Somebody who wants to do it on a 6, if you impose some rules, might discourage them enough that they choose not to. But someone who wants to do it at a 10 level, if you impose some rules, they're only going to do it like secretly. Okay, because again, not everybody's going to sort of be at that same level of demand. So those people who then do it secretly, well, now the problem becomes less visible, becomes harder to address. It's harder to, you can kind of see this in guns, where you see like a lot of guns in the streets that no one really knows clearly where they're coming from, who they're going to, because they're purchased in sort of underground, more secretive type ways, versus if they were just pure market transactions where, law enforcement, if they're investigating a murder or something like that, they could much more easily sort of get the records to trace sort of, hey, when was this gun purchased, who purchased the gun, things that law enforcement would need to do their job. Okay, again, the more things get pushed sort of underground, the harder it is to kind of do that. And again, same thing with like drugs, where basically it becomes harder for people. There's also a quality issue where basically people don't know the quality of what they're buying when they have to buy it sort of secretly. So you see this a lot of times with overdose on drugs, where people buy X drug and it's like something like fentanyl and they overdose. So you create not only the initial problem, which is sort of like, hey, they're doing this thing that maybe theoretically, let's say, not good for them. Okay, again, that's always, you can always debate whether any particular service or activity is good or bad. Not my intention here. But whatever, negative consequences may come from the activity, but you've now compounded that they are additional risk because they don't know if they're buying what they think they're buying. And then 3, they have to generally interact with people who are more likely to get violent, because generally when you're dealing with sort of the informal shadow markets, sort of illegal markets, generally what happens is that you don't have like traditional law enforcement to be sort of the physical force that can enforce contracts, okay, or enforce arrangements between parties. So in there, it becomes hey, you have to sort of enforce your contracts, and it becomes very, very violent. Okay, everyone, it gets violent. Okay, we're all aware of how organized crime works. Okay, and the end result is you have people interacting with unsafe people, buying possibly an unsafe good, and so they have the risk of getting murdered in the process. They have the risk of or getting violently hurt in the process of procuring the good or service because of the people they have to go to. The threat of it becoming again, like I think of like a fentanyl overdose where basically your drugs were like laced with something. There's all these sort of layers of things. Like again, if there were market transactions, a lot of these providers would have to buy insurance, and that insurance would have certain asks that it would make. On top of it, there would be certain liabilities that they would otherwise have that sort of basically begets sort of a natural level of more care. Also, they're going to have a more public brand that they're going to care for. So so all of these things make it where the provider cares more about the safety and happiness of the consumer. Like just aligns interests more when people can do things freely and openly. But also then what happens is you create a shortage. Okay, so for example, which skyrockets prices. So then you see prices going up, and this creates, again, if people are spending more, they're spending less on something else, and this has other sort of economic implications. And actually kind of like tug on that point, what I really want to say is like goes more to when you heavily regulate something. So like when you do prohibition, not by banning something, but prohibition by heavy regulation, heavy taxation, you create a shortage, so there isn't enough at a price that people can afford, but the demand still hasn't necessarily gone away. So then you still create black markets. And you see this like not just in drugs, but in immigration, in guns. There's like black markets for all these things. And those black markets, again, so when you take a look at like a lot of the tensions on the border, it's not necessarily always because there's more people, but it's because there's more people who are sort of outside of the system. So it becomes harder for them to really operate within society, whether that means having a job, being able to get a place to live, being able to really just sort of operate, basically be able to function the way we oftentimes take for granted, that, just being able to just kind of engage with anybody. Okay, like for example, as an American citizen, I can just pretty much do commerce with anybody within the United States, and I'm not worried whether this person can or can't sell to me, or what they can and can't sell to me, or what paperwork I can and can't fill out, and what the ramifications of that. That creates this whole sort of paradigm that creates a situation where you have like because again, the demand for necessarily traveling hasn't gone away. So then what you do is, but basically, since people have to procure that through black market means, they're is sort of in this weird position that ends up being worse for them, but also worse for people here. Okay, it's not a good situation for anybody. Ideally, you have, again, things sort of in open, free markets. And, yeah. So, bottom line is like basically libertarians have a general rule of thumb. Okay, and again, it doesn't matter. Like, not like, for example, not all libertarians are super passionate about guns. Some are. Like, I wouldn't consider myself one of the libertarians who are particularly passionate about guns, but I am passionate about being anti-prohibition because I am aware of the negative consequences that typically prohibitionary policies can have. And that's going to be sort of the common thread you'll find within libertarian thinking, that when government starts saying, hey, you can't do this, or very limiting how you control how you do things, there are generally going to be negative consequences on the other side. If, sometimes worse than others, okay? Not everything is the end of the world. Most things are not. But there's still, like, the question is, if you're going to, again, libertarians, since we default on liberty, again, so we're assuming that, hey, you should be able to do the thing, unless there's a really, really compelling reason not to, okay? So, for example, things like murder, theft, these are things where there's a really clear, compelling reason, because you are affecting somebody else, you are infringing on somebody else. Okay, fraud, whatnot, where basically you're engaging in what may on the surface look like a consensual arrangement, but with fraud, someone is not, basically what is actually happening is not what they're consenting to, so technically it's non-consensual. That's pretty clear. Okay, so fraud, it's pretty easy to kind of see the idea there that, hey, that is something that is something you don't let people do. Because again, it's not about them operating within their own life. You are now hurting others, their lives, their property, and whatnot. Okay, it's not just any sort of negative impact on others. So like, if I don't cut my lawn and someone else's property value drops, that's not me directly infringing on them. Like you can, because that logic goes really far. So, for example, like if I'm someone, like, you can start really, when you start saying, hey, everything that vicariously sort of affects others becomes something that government gets involved in, that becomes a really deep rabbit hole where you can kind of justify government getting involved in anything. For example, something like collectible card games. If I had a bunch of copies of a rare card and I burnt them, I could increase the value for the other people who have the card. Okay, so by not doing so, I'm preventing them from seeing an appreciation of value. Okay, or by forging the card, that you can decrease the value of the card. Okay, and then again, forgeries, that gets into fraud because they're not necessarily like legit. And again, question is what's legit, and there's a lot of, we can delve deeper into that. But bottom line, you can see that like not everything. Again, me burning the cards isn't fraud. That's just me destroying my own property, but it does have an effect on other people. Okay, not a direct effect on other people, but an effect. And this is oftentimes was referred to in economics as externalities. The fact that things, basically indirect effects that you have, indirect benefits and costs that you might put on others through your vicarious activity. But the problem is that if you start saying, hey, government should get in the business of externality management, that opens up the door to a lot of things. And again, as a libertarian, being sort of defaulting to saying, hey, I'll permit people to allow unless you can absolutely give me a reason not to. A clear cut reason that it's sort of like, hey, and that basically the cost is so great and the alternatives, and then there's no other alternative where the risk reward makes any sense. Basically really, 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 really last resort to intervene. Okay, libertarians are going to want to protect your ability to do the things that you want to do as much as possible. Almost absolutely. Okay, and again, how much it's going to range from libertarian to libertarian, but that's the general idea. So hopefully this episode gives you a better idea of how we think about prohibition at a high level. And just sort of, again, it's not so to say, hey, like, to particularly change your particular view on guns or immigration or, any of the issues where this can apply, like, abortion, goods and services, drugs, whatever. These are all things where you can kind of talk about prohibition within that context and really use those same levers. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't have differences of opinions on the individual applications of sort of this framework. But once you have this framework, it's much easier to kind of think why someone would be on whatever side they're on these issues, as particularly the libertarian side. And again, that's the aim of this show, not to necessarily tell people how to think, but to help people understand how some people think. And with that, I'll see y'all later. Have a great day and enjoy.